In a chapter from her 2007 monograph, Terrorist Assemblages, Jasbir Puar examines how the turban has been given material and visual meaning as a site of terrorist masculinity that has significant resonances with the queer South Asian diasporic conceptions of masculinity. At work more broadly in this chapter, entitled "The Turban is Not a Hat," Puar critiques the mistaken identity narrative that many Sikhs in the U.S. articulated in the wake of post-9/11 anti-Sikh violence and racial profiling. Similarly, in the aftermath of the attack of the Oak Creek Gurdwara this past August, accounts of mistaken identity popped up in the little mainstream media attention it received. The attack, carried out by known white supremacist Wade Michael Page, curiously demonstrates the connections between the turban as a visible marker of religious affiliation, the symbolic representation it has been given since 9/11 in connection with known or suspected terrorists, and the logics of racist violence and domestic terror. These connections enable an ongoing critique of accounts of mistaken identity, enabling an understanding that the struggles of Sikhs are intimately tied to the struggles of Muslims and various other members of South and West Asian diasporas. What is more, the majority of mainstream and alternative coverage of instances of harassment and profiling of Sikhs and Muslims, as well as the violence against these groups, produces the discourse of hate and hate-based logic, rather than understanding these contemporary phenomena in terms of race and racialization. My intervention takes shape as a critique of hate-based logic insofar as it serves to reject the ways in which religion has been racialized. That is, this rejection undermines the very fact that instances of harassment, profiling, and violence are structural and not individual, and that these instances are governed by various state security apparatuses. Moreover, I argue that a disavowal of Sikh and Muslim diasporic communities as racialized communities only serves to deny potential solidarities between similarly vulnerable populations. Thus, my paper asks three primary questions. How might we understand violence against Sikhs as a form of racist violence? Through a critique of hate-based logic, how does race-based logic recognize the structural nature of anti-Sikh and anti-Muslim violence? And lastly, how might Sikhs understand their ties to various other communities of color through the logics of race? In my interrogation, I looked to mainstream and alternative coverage of the Oak Creek tragedy, particularly from South and West Asian diasporic voices, as well as a close examination of recent anti-hate legislation in the U.S., specifically H.R. 1193, and contemporary theories of race, racialization, and structural violence. This paper endeavors to contribute to the fields of Sikh studies, Asian American studies, and critical studies of race, religion, and violence. As many of us are well aware, the mainstream coverage of the attack on the Oak Creek Gurdwara provided a rather intriguing example of the racial logics at work in the U.S. While we watched and heard the comparisons to Aurora, there were various notable differences in the coverage of these two events. Aurora victims were killed in a movie theater. Oak Creek victims were killed in a Gurdwara. Aurora victims were ordinary Americans. Oak Creek victims were part of our, quote, broader American family, end quote, as Obama stated. Aurora victims warranted a suspension of campaigning by Obama and Romney. Oak Creek victims did not, and neither president nor candidate visited Oak Creek in the aftermath of the attack. In comparison to the tragic rampage at Sandy Hook Elementary School in Newtown, Connecticut, similar distinctions might be drawn with reference to a shooting rampage at Cleveland Elementary School in Stockton, California in January 1989, where 5 school children were murdered and 30 injured by sole shooter 24-year-old Edward Purdy. Purdy, like Adam Lanza, had a history of mental illness. Unlike Sandy Hook, Cleveland Elementary's 5 victims were Cambodian or Vietnamese. Comparative race studies scholar Eric Tang interviewed families of the victims, writing on December 19, 2012, quote, "Each of the interviewees, in his or her own way, believed that the deaths of these children had been caused by a force greater than the psychotic behavior of a lone gunman. This larger force could be best described as a spirit of violence that pervaded their adopted homeland. America, they believe, had created a culture in which the broader public's fascination with militarism, domination, and destruction can feed to and heighten a person's disease and inner torment," end quote. The analogies we might draw in the case of these instances of gun violence might lend itself to understanding the ways in which the valuation of human life is rendered in the U.S. We see the mainstream coverage of Oak Creek as, yes, dismal, colored by the fact that Sikhs at a gurdwara are not representative of, quote, ordinary America, unquote, rather only interpolated as parts of a broader America. Broader in what sense? In such a designation, the distinctiveness of Sikh identity, even visually, forces a broadening, insofar as the capacity to empathize required is widened. That is to say that in the US, racialized subjects are devalued to the point where the very violence done unto them is apprehended as always already intelligible, cohering to a national narrative that is rife with violence, oppression, and the death of racial subjects, more often than not at the hands of white supremacy. What's curious then about Oak Creek and the various instances of racist violence against Sikhs in the wake of 9/11 is the sheer disavowal of the racial and racist logic of such violence and bloodshed. To be clear, the rhetoric of many Sikhs, and non-Sikhs for that matter, is that these instances are constituted as forms of hate violence. Few cite the use of hate as opposed to race as due to the fact that the deployment of hate includes criminality and violence based on race, sexuality, religion, disability, and so forth. Such inclusion and deployment of the term, in my understanding, relies on the disavowal of the racialization of religion since 9/11. I move now to the trope of mistaken identity. The trope of mistaken identity asserted by many Sikhs in the aftermath of such events of racist violence is troubling, to say the least. The mistaken identity narrative follows the trajectory that in the event of violence against Sikhs, and based on the logic of the perpetrator that deems the turban a symbol of terror, the targeting of Sikhs is based only on the logic of mistaken identity. That, in fact, Sikhs did not carry out the September 11th attacks, rather Muslim terrorists are responsible for that, and therefore they are the intended target. Returning to her essay, The Turban is Not a Hat, Jasbir Puar asserts, quote, the hypothesis of mistaken identity is the main causal factor for post-9/11 hate crimes, along with the liberal push to educate unknowing citizenry, relies on multiple premises. That the viewer, assumed to be white despite the proliferation of these attacks by people of color, is open to and willing to discern the visual differences between Sikh turbans and Muslim turbans. That the ideals of multiculturalism as promulgated by liberal education acknowledges that differences within differences matter. That violent backlash towards Sikhs claiming Sikhism as peaceful is a displacement of hostility from the rightful object as the real Muslims, end quote. Puar is right to critique the ways in which Sikhs have sought out to distinguish themselves from the rightful targets, Muslims, as it only reinforces the very Islamophobic roots of such violence. Of course, this narrative proliferated in the various local news outlets across the U.S. following Oak Creek, even in the aftermath of the sudden spat of attacks on mosques, including the burning down of a Joplin, Missouri mosque. In his Counterpunch article dated August 6, 2012, Vijay Prashad contrastively states, quote, the attack on Sikhs is not a mistaken attack. Sikhs are not mistaken for Muslims, but seen as part of the community of outsiders, end quote. To understand the place of Sikhs as part of a greater community of racialized bodies, brown bodies, is to recognize two critical paradigms. One, the place we occupy in the U.S. as not just a religious culture, but as part of a greater South Asian diaspora. And two, the larger U.S. imperial goals at work in the surveillance, profiling, and the greater cultures of harassment and violence against brown bodies in the post-9/11 world. Therefore, when violence against Sikhs, Muslims, or Hindus, as we see with the Queen's subway murder of Samato Sen in December, takes place in this age of terror, it is imperative that we understand these moments as charged with the racialization of religion, that such racialization binds us in ways previously unthinkable, and that social, political, and interfaith solidarities are essential at this juncture. I want to return to this notion of hate violence. In effect, whenever violence against Sikhs or Muslims has occurred in this age of terror, the perpetrators of such violence are understood as aberrations. In mainstream media outlets, they might be read as individuals who are mentally disturbed, asocial, traumatized by some past event that has left them damaged, diseased, and so forth. These perpetrators are pathologized and individuated to the point that disavows the very responsibility of our greater national, if not global, cultures of violence and racism. As an example, Wade Michael Page was dishonorably discharged from the U.S. military only to join a white supremacist movement and form a band that called for the reassembling of a white nation in the face of an ever more multicultural and multiracial America. Page was regarded in the coverage of Oak Creek as part of a fringe white supremacist movement that has little to do with the cultural and racial realities that surround all of us. Yet as some alternative coverage of Page emerged, white supremacist groups are not as subcultural as imagined. In fact, since 9/11, the number of white supremacist groups has more than tripled from over 3,000 in early 2001 to over 1,100 in 2011. In rendering the racist ideologies that bind such groups as fringe or subcultural, we run the risk of continuing to pathologize the perpetrators and treat such acts of violence as simply a result of individuated biological and social factors. In identifying hate as a rubric that is inclusive of all variations of violence against difference, there is an easy resistance to deeming such violence as simply racist or as an act of domestic terror in the case of Oak Creek. What I want to emphasize then is the sheer misappropriation of hate onto instances of racist violence and domestic terror. I say this because I see that specifically in the Sikh community, in recognition of rampant Islamophobia in the West, and in a measure of self-protection, understanding violence done unto us in terms of race and terror exists as taboos. Of course, this is not exclusive to the Sikh community in the US, as the taboo of race and racial logic means returning to a pre-colorblind or racial world. As a nation, there is comfort in the notion of colorblindness and the post-racial. However, the reality of colorblindness and post-raciality quite literally means, for one, the denial of difference, and secondly, the renunciation of the American nation-state's historical legacy of racist violence against blacks, immigrants, and communities of color. Thus, in comprehending the racialization of religion both in the US and globally, Sikhs must recognize that ours is a culture embedded in the historical legacy of honoring and recognizing difference, as well as fighting oppression and persecution in the name of justice. Instead, we observe the re-articulation of Sikhism as a peaceful religion, that we are in fact American and only othered by the ways in which we practice religion in this country. In an effort to renounce any affiliation with violence and or terror, there are efforts to only quell such misappropriations as a method of having Sikhs cohere to the liberal multicultural national narrative, a narrative that happily sees itself as a part of Obama's broader American family narrative, rather than evaluate the status of Sikhs as part of a quote-unquote community of outsiders, to borrow again from Prashad. As noted by Dr. Balbinder Singh Bogle in his address at Hofstra University in October, quote, "The Sikh community needs to resist the rush to placate social anxieties, as this is exactly how the secular state seeks to domesticate their political voice by co-opting it to a passive religio-secular liberalism," end quote. Bogle is exactly right in interrogating this rush to placate social anxieties, as this translates into firstly, the mistaken identity trope, and secondly, into the push to self-protect and prevent further violence against Sikhs. To say that we are peaceful and we are Americans only serves to distinguish ourselves from those already perceived as violent in dominant national discourses, to further underscore the potential threat that those already deemed violent continue to pose to the American people. Particularly, there must be cognizance of the fact that such rhetoric is Islamophobic and serves only to divide two similarly racialized communities. It is therefore essential to understand the coherence of Sikhs to a larger national narrative as Islamophobic, is to remain critical of the racialization of religion while simultaneously comprehending the very complexities of such racialization as not new. Let us not forget the 1907 Bellingham riots against South Asian immigrant laborers. Let us not forget the 1914 Komagata Maru incident in Vancouver, British Columbia, where Sikhs, Muslims, and Hindus were denied entry to Canada despite claims to imperial subjectivity. In apprehending the racialization of Sikhs in the US, interfaith and interethnic solidarities become imperative. Racialization must not necessarily translate into further differentiation and division. Rather, it should serve to provide solidarity amongst the bodies so clearly targeted historically and in the present moment, rendered as one and the same, rendered at face value. In an example of such solidarity, I want to turn now to Illinois' recent anti-hate legislation, House Resolution 1193. Such a document provides a curious demonstration of racial logic under the terminology of hate, as well as a way to quell violence, not just against Sikhs, but other parts of the South Asian diaspora, as well as various communities of color, who are policed and heavily targeted in variegated modes. Formally adopted on November 27, 2012, H.R. 1193 is, as stated on the blog American Turban, quote, more of a statement against anti-Asian bigotry than a legal resolution, end quote. In effect, H.R. 1193 provides insights into the ways that we might continue to work with others within and outside of the South and West Asian diasporas. The language of the resolution itself is incredibly rich in the ways that it reflects much of what I've critiqued and recommended here today. The emphasis in this document on the solidarity not only between Sikhs and Muslims in the US, but South Asian American and Arab Americans is a radical push on the oft divisive language used in the aftermath of racist violence against these groups. Moreover, it addresses and critically reflects on the racist violence that has affected these communities since the September 11th attacks. While there are some moments in 1193 that indeed further a liberal, multicultural, nationalist agenda, I will not delve into my critique for the sake of time. Instead, I want to highlight the radical potential of such legislation insofar as it does seek to recognize Sikhs and Muslims in the same context, and particularly as part of a greater community that must work together in anti-racist coalition. Thank you.